Welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Donna Hill, the Executive Director at the Center for Black Literature. Writers on Writing is brought to you and supported by Medgar Evers College, CUNY, and can be heard on WNYE 95.1 FM on the first and third Sunday. And I am happy to have as my guest today award-winning journalist Michael Harriot, author of Black AF History, the Un-Whitewashed Story of America. So before we get started, let me just take a moment to introduce our guest, whose resume is extensive, to say the least. When CNN wanted to trace the origins of the word woke, they called Michael Harriot. When MSNBC needed someone to unpack critical race theory, they called Michael. And when the culture needed a name that captured the collective voice of Black Twitter, Michael was the runaway answer. Michael Harriot is the award-winning journalist, best-selling author, celebrated poet, and public historian, hailed as one of the most eloquent writers in America. Since its 2023 release, his New York Times bestseller, Black AF, The Un-Whitewashed Story of America, has been a top-selling Black history book in the country since its launch. He is the 2024-2025 recipient of the Harvard University's Nyan Prize for Public Policy Journalism and the founder of the Black Journalism Collective, Contraband Comp, which I totally enjoy. Known for his acerbic wit and unflinching reporting, he has served as a columnist for The Guardian, The Griot, and The Root, shaping everything from presidential politics to pop culture. As the originator of the phrase, invited to the cookout, that was new for me. I'm glad I found that out. His viral social media threads contextualizing Black history have reached millions, earning him the unofficial crown as the king of Black Twitter. He has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, the New York Times, and as he likes to note, his mother's refrigerator. His work has been recognized by the National Association of Black Journalists, the Emmy Awards, the Webby Awards, and the American Library Association. Michael holds degrees in mass communications and history from Auburn University and a master's in macroeconomics and international business from Florida State. Today, he serves as founder and lead columnist at Contraband Camp and is one of the nation's most sought-after speakers on the intersections of race, history, politics, and media. Michael, thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So to just kind of set the tone for how we're going to proceed, I just want to share a quote that's actually on your book from journalist Joy Reid. And she wrote, "This history is as it should be told. Straight, no chaser, unvarnished, unembossed. Michael Harriot, the Samuel L. Jackson of the written word, strikes again, weaving fascinating facts, scathing humor, and pieces of his own life to deal with the stony road we trod." So, as we all know, Samuel L. pulls no punches, and neither does Black AF. Let me just say, Michael, that I spent many hours being pissed off and cussing as I was reading. The level of atrocities and abuses that have been heaped upon Black folks is mind-boggling. But as fast as I got sucked into my anger, you throw a counterpunch with a pithy one-liner or an amusing aside. So how did you decide to use that as a countermeasure for the heaviness of this text?
Well, I don't know if I thank you, but I don't know if it was that great of a decision by me. Like, I don't know if I thought of it in that way. I wanted to write the book, and I've always written like in the manner that Black people communicate with each other. And you know how we are.
Yeah.
We could be at our grandmama's funeral, but if somebody come in there with the wrong hat or the wrong dress or the wrong shoes or singing a solo that can't sing, we're gonna make fun of it, right? And that's how I approach writing. In many ways, I don't try to include jokes. I just don't feel the need to take them out. And I think that's how Black people have always communicated with each other, because you have to have some kind of levity to endure this pain. And I think I thought that I wanted to make the writing as authentic to the audience as possible.
Mhm. And it definitely did that, because I know for me, as I was reading through it, and then, I listened to it as well. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. But as I was reading, and then, I would hear, I could hear your voice sort of saying, um, you know, uh, something out of the ordinary that wasn't directly affecting the text, but it did affect the text. It's much like, the comedians, that come on stage, and they'll have you laughing, but at the end of it, it's this political commentary, and you're like, oh, okay, I get
Right.
it now, Um, and I felt that you sort of were doing that in the reverse. Like, you give us this stuff, and then you ease us back a little bit. It's like, okay, yeah, I get it. And so I really appreciated that. Black AF takes us on a journey of highs and lows, from way before colonization and enslavement right up to today's shenanigans. We always find our way through. But for you, and all of the work and the research that you did, what was there a discovery that actually shook you?
There were so many that were new, and so many that kind of shook me. And I have to say that when I started writing this book, I it was because I was beginning to realize, as someone who was homeschooled,
Hmm.
people, most Americans, right? I always got asked the questions like, what book should I read? Or I would hear the phrase, well, they didn't teach us that in school. And
Hmm.
so the most surprising thing to me was that Black people actually expected the school system to teach them their history,
Yeah.
right? Like, I always assumed, because I started going to school later in life, right, that, oh, the stuff that they're telling me, I assumed it wasn't true. I assumed it was through the white lens. And I never expected them to be teaching me something about me. I thought that was the stuff that we had to regurgitate on the test, or that was required to pass the SAT. And so, but there were some things that I learned about America, about Black people, while researching this book. I've always known that Black people were here before 1619, but the idea of people like Juan Garrido and Esteban, who the natives said, that was one of my favorite quotes in the book, was the old Pueblo saying, well, the first white man we saw was a Black man, right? And our involvement in just building this project. But I think the most surprising thing to me overall was the ineptitude of the white people who we valorize as founders.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. So just talking about that, like delving into that darkness of American history, how did discovery after discovery affect your spirit and your mind? Like, how do you cleanse your palate, after absorbing all of this stuff?
Well, sadly, as a Black man in America, I don't know if there can be a palate cleanser, one, especially as someone who kind of knows history, and especially also as a journalist who's covered, so many. I was thinking the other day that, I was asking one of my friends who is a civil rights attorney, like, we were trying to figure out how many people on the planet have seen more people be killed by police than me. And, we settled on like maybe 50 to 100, right?
Mhm.
And so just reporting on Black issues for throughout my career, right? The history today from back then is no different than reporting about America today, right? Like, we see atrocities now. And
Right.
so I don't know if there is can be a palate cleanser for someone who knows about America now, knows about America's past, and lives in America and experiences that atrocity.
Hmm. And as true as that statement is, it is sad and disappointing at the same time that there's no way to get away from that. That we are constantly under siege, for lack of a better word, and it's every day. And the code switching that we have to do, and looking over our shoulders, and as a mother worrying about my son having to go out into the world. What's that like for him? And so, I would like you to talk to us a little bit about, as we move through this world, as Black people, how do we keep our spirits up against all of these odds?
Well, I think, the way that we have traditionally done it and the way we still do it is through community, right? Like, when the world is on fire as it currently is, we always have had a safe space among each other, right? The monster is always outside of the door, but
Hmm.
you don't always have to focus on the monster. And, all of us sometimes get used to living with the monster outside of the door, right? And when you get accustomed to that, you can focus on, hey, what's inside the house, right? Like, look at the love, look at the food, look at the music, listen to the music, laugh, dance, and sing. Because ultimately, I in the beginning of the book, I talk about growing up in a Black family in a Black neighborhood. I lived grew up in a hometown that was about 50% Black, 50% white, and it was segregated. So I never really considered white people on a day-to-day basis, right? Whether they were good or evil or bad or good or dangerous or benevolent, I just didn't think about them, right? My community and the world, the universe that I lived in, my Black cinematic universe, for lack of a better word, was good.
Hmm.
And so I didn't really have to make a concerted effort to kind of separate the two, because I know, and I still do know, where to find community.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you should say that because, when I was growing up, I grew up in that same kind of environment. I lived in a Black community, and I went to a Black school, and we went to church, but it was all Black people. And so the only white people that I had any dealings with was maybe the one store owner that was left in the community after it changed over, or the nuns in the school. And that was it. So I didn't really think about them. And I didn't see them as an issue for me until, much later in life, when I really understood what was happening. So that's interesting that,
Yeah.
and I'm sure a lot of people are like that.
Yeah, I used to teach a class called Race as an Economic Construct. And one of the things that I used to like to do, like in one of the first two classes, is I would just ask people without looking, before you Google it, what do you think the demographics of where you lived are? Right. And people always overestimated their race. So Black people would say, yeah, my time was about 50% Black. And it was never 50% Black, of rarely 50%. And the same with white people. Right.
Mhm.
And that perception of the world is real to you. Right. In the world you live, it is, and most people live, it is mostly people like them. And
Right.
so I think being Black is not necessarily being consumed by that existence of the monster. I think it is understanding that you have to know your community and know what the monster is doing. You know, there's that old saying, Black people know white people better than white people know themselves. And I think that is the dichotomy, not necessarily, you know, being consumed with the danger or the peril of living as a Black person in America.
Yeah. So, the book itself is not only, historical, but it's also a workbook. At the end, and sometimes embedded in the chapter, you pose questions and offer activities. In a lot of books, you'll see, at the end of the book is, reader's guide, so you have some questions that you can ask when people get together and talk about the book. But you inserted a lot of that stuff directly
Right.
into the text. So what led you to do that? And, when you first conceived of the project and saw it sort of coming together, and being, an educator yourself, was that a conscious decision? Like, why did you decide to use that as a tool?
Well, one, I think creating it as if it was a textbook was intentional because I wanted it to be something that you were intentionally or knowingly learning
Hmm.
from. And it kind of gave a way to, like, I can tell the history and, you know, objectively or use the storytelling methods that I use. And then at the end of the chapter, in those questions, right, I can kind of give my commentary, right? So, for instance, right, I do a whole chapter on the Black religion, right?
Hmm.
And I don't have to talk about my religious experience, right? But at the end of the chapter, I do this thing where I list a bunch of stuff about Black churches and say how, and the questionnaire is, how Black was your church, right? Like, did your grandmama have the Holy Ghost, right? Right. So I could tell the history and then have like commentary or like connect it to the current day um existence
Hmm.
through those things. And but I did think that the textbook framework also is familiar to people,
Hmm.
right? You know, you can say, well, and it also gives you the opportunity where you don't have to read it from chapter 1 to chapter 15. You can start in chapter 8 if you just want to know about Reconstruction, or you can start in chapter 15, right? And so I think all of those things are were part of the reason that I did it. And in this age of the internet and streaming and social media, how do you make a interactive book, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Something that is not just me talking to a reader or the audience, but something where the reader can talk back to the book. And that's one of the strategies that I used.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that, as I was going through it, and because a lot of times, you're sitting down and you're reading and you're reading and you're reading, and it just becomes words, right? And so then all of a sudden you get to, page 45, and it's like, here's these questions. So what did you think about such and such? And it's like, oh, well, was I really paying attention? How much of it did I actually absorb? So I think that those are really helpful too for readers, to really be paying attention to what is happening. Did you get what, did the reader get what you try to share with them? On the other side by having like these different questions and activities. So I thought that was like really cool. So while I was reading, I was, as I was saying earlier, I kind of toggled back and forth between the novel and listening to the book as I was walking around. So the audio, of course, brings a whole different flavor to the narrative, especially the humorous asides, because like I said, I can hear your voice when I go back to the text and hear you. So how was the decision made for you to read your own work? And what was that experience like?
Well, I think I never considered hiring an actor to read. I've written parts of books where, you know, in anthologies and stuff, where someone else read my words and it never kind of translates. And people who listen to audiobooks have always told me it's always better when the author reads it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made a decision from that. And the process was like, as someone with ADD, I was essentially ADHD. I was essentially sitting in a closet for 8 hours a day for 2 weeks. So uh it was time consuming, and it was it was hard,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it ultimately made a better product.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked it. And I think that, as the writer, you can say the words the way that you mean them. And they come across as completely different than, having somebody else interpret what you're saying, or just reading it flat across, and interpreting it yourself as the reader. So I think that that worked really well. So everything that this country is, has been shaped and defined by Black folks, without a doubt. Even the laws that oppress us have been shaped by Black folks. But talk a bit about some of the unsung individuals that you may have discovered in your research that actually set the bar for those who came after them, from food and music and social programs and even comedy.
Right. I think one of the people that I discovered a few years ago was I did an excerpt in the book. So the book is not just like a chapter, then questionnaire. It is like just like a social studies book, right? There are little excerpts about figures, and
Mhm.
one of them is about a man named Charlie Case, who was the first stand-up comedian, who essentially invented stand-up comedy. And because of the writing on him, a lot of people, even comedians, have told me like no one ever knew this,
Yeah.
right? It was kind of a known thing during the vaudeville days, and it kind of just fell, into like a little trivia question.
Mhm.
But Charlie Case, and like what's interesting about him is that they didn't know what to call what he did. Like there were people who sang funny songs and there were people who did skits, but they didn't even have a term for somebody who just stood up and talked and made people laugh. Like, there was no backing band. So they used to call him the man who just talks. Right. And so he was one of those people who kind of is an example of that. Another one that everybody mentions is Forrest Joe, who was this bandit in the coastal region of South Carolina in the 1820s, who terrorized Georgia and South Carolina for 3 years, and is the origin of America's first police force. So America's first police force was created to catch one guy, and it was essentially a battle between the enslaved people who were enslaved on plantations, who were feeding him intelligence so he could get away, and all of the white people thought like he had superpowers because he always seemed to escape. And it turns out that he had invented in 1820 a bulletproof vest. And so that's a fascinating story that everyone loves.
Wow. So when you were doing, just in terms of topic of research, like you were compiling all of this information, because the amount of resources in the book is phenomenal. So how long did it take you to compile the information and then write the book? And is there enough material that didn't make the cut that may be found later on?
Yeah, so it took me about, so I didn't it didn't happen like I'm going to compile the information and then I'm going to write the book. So
Mhm.
I work with a historian, Blair Kelly, who is the president of the National Humanities Foundation now, and she is a professor, a history professor. She was teaching at North Carolina State. She was the dean of the Pan African Studies department there. And what we did was imagine if there was a course, like a 13-week semester course
Mhm.
that taught the real truth of Black history. And then we divided those topics up into chapters. And then we said, okay, this chapter has to include this, and this. And the next chapter has to include this. And then we dove in on those topics. So I wrote a chapter, then I turned it in, wrote a chapter, turned it in, because we knew what the division of the chapters would be. And there was a lot of stuff that we didn't include in it. First of all, like, I am a huge nerd and fanboy of studying about revolts of enslaved people. So they essentially told me, like, hey, you got to just stop. We can't put any more revolts in there. So there was actually a an addition that was, we looked at all of the data and say, hey, this is a plan based on all of the revolts that we know about, how you can start a slave. So it was called, So You Want to Start a Slave Revolt. Um, that was one that was missing, right? Like, so for instance, right, like, people think of them as happening on plantations, but the most successful ones, and most of them, happened on ships on the way here, right? Most of them happen not at night, but in the early morning, right? You got to get you somebody who can speak everyone's language, right? So stuff like that. And then there was another chapter. There were a lot of other chapters that, we couldn't include all of the information that we wanted to talk about. So for instance, there was a chapter on we talk about mob violence, but there was a chapter on armed resistance, right? Like, who are the greatest leaders of armed resistance? And we eventually folded some of it up into other chapters, but there was a standalone chapter. So there is a mountain of stuff that we couldn't include in the book.
So can we anticipate seeing that those materials published at some point?
Yeah, so some of them are included in my next book, which is, I think while we're going through this political / social moment, and we keep hearing people talk about fascist government and tyranny, and they keep using Nazi Germany and Mussolini's hit Italy as a kind of an example. And I keep telling people, Black Americans are the only people in the history of this planet who defeated a fascist government without an army. And so the next book is the lessons from Black history on how to defeat tyranny using just the lessons from Black history. And so a lot of those contain some of the stories that weren't in the book, and stories that we never, we never researched in the book.
And when do you think you'll be finished?
Well, the manuscript is turned in. I think
Oh,
the scheduled release date is sometime next year.
wonderful, wonderful. So we'll be definitely looking forward to that. So, you did mention, the whole social construct and things like that. And as a macroeconomics uh, 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 person who has studied macroeconomics, talk a bit about the social, economic, and political parallels between the past and the current state of Blackness in America today.
Well, I think teaching about history and race through the lens of economics is a better way to understand it, because otherwise, right, when you're using just social theory, you're talking about what people believe, right? And so, and when I talk about economics, I'm not just talking about money. I'm not just talking about, um, you know, uh, supply and demand, but the principles of data and the principles of economics. So, for instance, right, I always tell people, like, we have this idea that capitalism is responsible for racism,
Mhm.
right? And that's a pervasive belief, even by the most radical thinkers. And I always tell people, like, if you really study capitalism, first of all, capitalism never existed in America, right? The we even when you point to, for instance, slavery, right? Slavery was not a capitalist venture. It was not market dictated, right? The government ensured that if you lost your human property, this whole government has guaranteed in our foundational document, the Constitution, that you'll get it back. Right? To be American is to say that you'll never lose your slave, right? And so when we look at the foundation of America and we compare it to today, we see that many of those things still exist, right? Like we live in a time now where our government has ensured the richest people that you'll never lose your wealth, right? We'll protect you from it. If your bank fails, we'll prop it up. We'll use the taxpayer dollars to prop it up. If your company fails, like we'll give you a government contract. And so there are many parallels with that. But the state of Blackness in America now is not decidedly different. I think one thing that this book and this current situation has highlighted is that the progress that we've made didn't necessarily change the vast majority of people's minds, and we were under the belief that the minds have changed, and that those racist ideations and those white supremacist constructs don't exist anymore, and they still do.
Yep.
Right. And we're experiencing that. And I think history is the best way to teach us. Like, if you understand Reconstruction, you'll understand what we're going through now. If you understand Jim Crow, right, you'll understand, like, the first thing they did is like, hey, we got to erase this history and make it like the South didn't lose, and it wasn't like slavery wasn't racist, and like the founders weren't these racist slave owners. We know better now, but we still have this mythology. And the biggest thing I think we have to underscore today versus what we did in the past is like when we signed the Civil Rights Act, when we, after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Act, after Jim Crow, we just said, hey, all those people who did all that bad stuff, let's let bygones be bygones. And the surest way, now we know that the surest way to ensure that it happened again is to never hold the people accountable who did it the first time. And, I think that we're seeing this now, in that the danger that we'll face if we get through this moment, if America survives, we know Black people will, is that we won't take names and we'll forgive and forget.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. I wish I could talk to you some more. I'll get a chance to talk to you in a couple of weeks. But before we wrap up, tell us how we can follow you, how we can listen to you. Where can we find you?
So you can find me on all social media at Michael Harriot, MichaelHarriot. All my social media is the same. And I write daily and run, again, Writers Collective. So it's me and, journalists and writers like Ellie Mastal, Joy Reid, Tiffany Cross, writers and thinkers at contrabandcamp.com. And so you can find me there every day.
Yes, definitely check out contrabandcamp.com. And for those of you who are listening, you can actually get to meet Michael and get a signed copy of Black AF at the 18th National Black Writers Conference on March 25th at Medgar Evers College. He will be in conversation with Nicole Hannah-Jones and moderated by our very own Dr. Brenda Green. Michael, thank you so very much. I'm looking forward to meeting you in a couple of weeks. The conference for everyone runs from March 25th to March 28th, and you can register at the Center for Black Literature.org. In the meantime, you've been listening to Writers on Writing, supported by Medgar Evers College, and you can find us on our website, centerforblackLiterature.org, on our YouTube channel, and by listening to WNYE 95.1 FM on the first and third Sundays. So until next time.